Hi, I'm Dr. Sophie Handler, and welcome to my paper, Art by Children and Children by Art, Emancipating and Exploiting the Voice of Childhood in Modernist Art. Peter Coveney argued that the long 19th century was, quote, an age in which it became increasingly difficult to grow up, to find valid bearing in an adult world. As a result, there was a tendency, as he puts it, to, quote, take the line of least emotional resistance and to regress quite literally into a world of fantasy and nostalgia for childhood. Wedged in the constantly fluctuating chasm between tradition and modernity, convention and progression, the long 19th century was a period characterized by writers and artists who sought a regressive escape into the nostalgia of the child and its multifarious states. For as many causes, reasons, and designs as there were behind these figures' return or regression to the childhood state, there emerged a twofold manifestation of this peculiar affliction of nostalgia, comprising those who wanted to go back to the beginning to start afresh, and those who just simply wanted to go back. In many ways, the undulating crossover between old and new which characterized the long 19th century served as a backdrop which mirrored the child's condition and experiences in this period. Between the poles of the pre-Enlightenment Dark Ages and the perceived enlightened epoch of 20th century modernity, between the markers of birth and adulthood, endures a most shadowy existence. This shadowland is one whose constantly shifting layers of fading tonality and endlessly morphing shapes of ambiguity come to symbolize not only the obscurity with which this period was awash, but more particularly the multifaceted concepts, roles, images, and experiences of the otherized child. Their shadowiness is characterized not only by their perceived otherness, but by their role in negotiating an in-between world, straddling the crossroads of modernity and nature, fallacy and truth, imagination and reality, and the constant merging thereof, in and amongst the hurly-burly of a world caught between tradition and modernization. By combining not only the study of children and childhood with that of art history, but also within the specific context of the long 19th century, this paper seeks to lift the lid on the relationship between the groundbreaking emergence of modernism and the social and cultural history of children and childhood as its blueprint. With the rapid, destabilizing, and psychologically corrosive onset of modernity, during which empty priorities and long-standing falsehoods were slowly called into question, a search for truth and genuine sense of selfhood was never so pressing. Such considerations and endeavours have been exemplified in the studies of figures such as Charles Baudelaire, Paul Cézanne, Ernst Ludwig Kirchner, Erich Heckel, Henri Rousseau, and Roger Fry. There fast emerged a melancholic reflection on one's relinquishment of the magic and wisdom of childhood to gain admission into the empty world of adulthood. Accordingly, a re-immersion into the depths of childhood as a means of reliving and reclaiming what adulthood has served to whitewash seemed the most effective and revelatory way of unpacking the past and finding the truth. Of course, this process often proved as destructive, conflating, and counterproductive as other more prominent voyages of discovery, both historical and ongoing. For as we wrap ourselves in these garbs of old, encumbering our own histories and the fate of a new generation with the notion that children become a vision of futurity for all, we tend to lose sight that, as Daniel Thomas Cook puts it, quote, not all children are our future, because not all children are ours, and because not all children promise or pretend a desired future. Whilst it is often the case that childhood seems to present a mirror in which we can view ourselves young and old simultaneously, it is not nearly so often so clear a reflection as the metaphor suggests. Childhood, Betty Goldstone explains, is not a biological fact. Rather, it is a socially contrived state of being determined by culture. The concept of childhood is dynamic, changing to fit the needs of the community. As such, we can perceive the emergence of an acute practice in which childhood as a concept becomes a discovery and trope of adult convenience. Whilst it is broadly considered the case that children, either ignorant or willfully reticent towards neatly documenting their secrets and experiences, rarely leave clear evidence revealing what it is like to be a child, adults have taken advantage of this, snatching the opportunity to write their own histories and the futures of others. Convenient discovery or calculated invention, the adult pursuit of childhood culminates in adults imagining and inventing childhood in order to make sense of their own world, whilst children are forced to live with the consequences of becoming a trope in the modern adult's pursuit of resolution. Referring to William Empson's notion of the taproot, when describing the fashion amongst turn-of-the-century artists and writers to make use of the image and experiences of children and childhood as a means of both distraction and inspiration, Coveney summarised how childhood as a concept became a self-pitying and, quote, habitual means of escape from a tired and confusing culture in which it felt increasingly difficult to grow up, and to which regression into fantasy and nostalgia seemed the perfect antidotary protest, using the child as, quote, a symbol of the greatest significance for the subjective investigation of the self. The latter decades of the 19th century saw a gradual glorification of regression, for example in France by Arthur Rimbaud's Cult of Childhood, and efforts to retain the man-child within, and in Britain with John Ruskin's encouragement to recover the innocence of the eye in order to produce artistic representations with the fresh vitality of the child. This reached fever pitch by the turn of the century, when the inevitable decay of living could be thwarted by an artistic and literary return to one's youth. In many ways, childhood was something that needed to be kept alive in oneself to prevent what might be understood as a death of the soul. Indeed, this period's particular overflowing of nostalgia was characterized by the formation of what Bellmer and Leventhal call an idealized past with an unsatisfactory present. When Linda Nochlin defined realism as, quote, the demand for contemporaneity and nothing but contemporaneity, she consequently offered some insight into the movement which sought to rally against it, modernism. In opposition to the acceptance of contemporary existence as seen and recorded by the realists, modernists rejected the notion of a fixed state of contemporaneity in favour of a process by which one is in permanent flux of self-conscious revision and partaking in a progressive trend of thought that encourages and facilitates human capacity to create and reshape. Accordingly, the modernist approach has more than once been likened to a process of unlearning to relearn. The modernist ethos affords a relinquishment of outdated values previously learned in favour of a persistent and ongoing replenishment of new, more self-consciously considered ones in what Colin Rhodes calls, quote, the act of undressing through the removal of the complex social masks imposed by modern urban culture, allowing for the garbing of oneself in any number of changing outfits. It seemed as though by regressing to the beginning to unlearn all that modernity had incumbent upon one could rediscover a state of infancy from which to commence the modernist process. Compelled by the twists and turns of the Parisian avant-garde in the early 20th century, artist and critic Roger Fry was captivated not only by the growing presence in modern art and literature of themes related to childhood, but significantly also by the alternative vision offered by the child itself as a contributor to visual culture, especially its unfettered insight. Most particularly, Fry was struck by the child's capacity to use their imagination in a profoundly creative manner, bringing everyday objects and conjured figments to life through art and thus establishing a crucial link between the imaginative and creative spheres. Fry accredits much of this ability to the child's propensity to form attachments to seemingly inanimate objects and environments as much as to other people. Whilst many scholars and artists believed in a link between children and nature, extending this to the assertion that it was from the latter that the former drew creative inspiration, Fry was more convinced by the idea of the inspiration of childhood and child art itself working in tandem with the reflection of the self. In other words, untaught artistic practice among children is demonstrative of the unrestricted personhood of its maker. As Fry himself put it, quote, children, if left to themselves, never draw from nature, but express, with a delightful freedom and sincerity, the mental images which make up their own imaginative lives. Such focus on selfhood and individuality invites Nietzschean philosophy, whose criticism of modern man's inclination towards what he termed the herd instinct proved influential in the understanding of late 19th and early 20th century avant-garde art and literature. Infuriated by modern man's tendency to blindly behave and think like the majority, Nietzsche implored that one must instead liberate one's mind, ultimately giving rise to the sort of modernist output that found the individually and perceived freshness of childhood an enormous creative influence, both as a conceptual theme and a blueprint for artistic practice. The establishment of the child as a symbolic trope of modernism, as well as the emergence of the childlike as a stylistic aim of the avant-garde, manifested itself multifariously. It is worth noting here that it often seems the case that, symptomatic of the long-standing underestimations of the child, children's art is often referred to as though it is a standardized product, when in reality their output is just as varied as that of adults. This is typical of the way adults not only generalize their understanding of children and childhood in a fashion that was neglectful of personhood and difference, but also their proclivity to make something of a fetishistic novelty of the perceived features and tendencies of children and their state. Modernist champions of children and the childish rallied against the suggestion that playful, expressive art is intellectually shallow, instead showcasing that, as Richard Schiff puts it, contrary to the diligent and formalistic rule-following of most adult art, quote, children's artistic practice was natural, sincere, and disinterested. Whilst artistic production inspired by that of children often received the critical charge of childish incompetence, its proponents were instead struck by what Marcel Franciscano has called, quote, the power of the child's naive vision to reveal truths closer to more sophisticated perception. Whereas adults tend to stereotype what they see, children, driven by the spontaneity of movement, draw precisely from life or from imagination, producing a profoundly authentic rendering of personal vision unaffected by the constraints of convention or formalist training. Barbara Borag has written of the child's unique graphic language, which is typified by not only, quote, box people, but general distortions of form and ambiguous treatment of space. Not only do children entirely disregard structural roles which customarily restrict formal art production, but their styles and processes afford the notion of a sort of folding out in drawings, whereby they adopt a sort of continuous picture formation that reflects the busy and unconstrained stream of consciousness that inspires it. Gigi Pospelov agrees, firm in the belief that, quote, children are not interested in the result but in the process. He remarks upon the strength of the child's conceptual vision over the appeal of concrete reality. Considered by Meir Shapiro to be the ultimate source of creativity unabridged by convention, the child and his art becomes the most, quote, pure archetype of the painter of modern life, as coined by Baudelaire. Accordingly, lamenting the long-standing process by which, in Schiff's rather Nietzschean terms, most children abandoned artistic anarchy and idiosyncrasy to join the utilitarian herd, once educated and cultured, modern artists sought to subvert the denigration of this authentic artistic blueprint by channeling its themes, features, and processes into their own work. This collection of avant-garde figures, growing larger and more pervasive with time, dedicated their artistic production to this aim with such diligence that the increasingly common comparisons between modern abstraction and children's art were scarcely surprising. Whilst, as Turner points out, quote, modern art was, and still is, dismissed with the cliché, a child could have done it, prominent members of the modernist avant-garde played up to this criticism, with figures such as Vasily Kandinsky, Paul Klee, Henri Matisse, Pablo Picasso, Joan Miro, and Jean Dubuffet owning sizable collections of children's art and others choosing to exhibit it. These shared exhibitions of the work of modern artists and children provided a tangible scaffold to support the more conceptual connection between modernism and childhood, offering a concrete manifestation of the way in which artists, Turner continues, studied and imitated the spontaneous and willful distortions of children's pictures as though, like dreams, they offered a royal road to the unconscious and the inner child in all of us. Such was the significance of this perceived connection between the child and the modern artist that James Sully proffered a semblance between play and creativity, a theory that proved a prominent mainstay in 20th century pedagogic study. Whilst figures such as Picasso and Klee experimented with toys, making rudimentary playthings for their children, the simplistic shapes they fashioned soon became influential features of the Cahiers d'Art publication and Bauhaus shows, respectively. Similarly, whilst in the 1960s John Burgess disparagingly accused Picasso of being reduced to playing like a child, his pioneering Cubist style could instead be congratulated for, as Andrew Graham Dixon stated, quote, taking the language of Western art to pieces as if it were a jigsaw puzzle and giving a platform to the voice of childish expression. These giants at play, these giants of modernism, were changing the course of art production. Thus their work unsurprisingly interacted. Like children playing together, they shared and swapped, argued and stole. While Picasso acknowledged the influence his great rival Matisse had upon his own work, perhaps the greatest theft amongst these childlike artists was that which they took from children themselves. When he declared that, quote, the more helpless they are, the more instructive their examples, Clay revealed something of the exploitative nature of the modernist harnessing of the child. From the practice amongst members of the De Blauwreiter of rummaging about in children's nurseries for inspiration, to Clay's copying of his own son Felix's drawings into his own work, childhood was ransacked for its symbolic value and modernist gravitas. Given that Picasso is supposed to have once said that all children are born with an artistic genius that most then subsequently forget, there seems to have been some degree of urgency amongst modernist figures to extract this wisdom before it was too late. The inspiration of child art went beyond mere child's play and the appeal of just its naivety and freshness of vision, however. In the formation of conceptual abstract styles, it would contribute to what Kandinsky called, quote, the improvement and refinement of the human soul. Kandinsky's particular concerns about materialism pointed to the anxieties at the very heart of another artist, whose subtly foreboding work simultaneously warned of modernity's impending shifts and laid the foundations of the modernist deviation in artistic vision and perception, Paul Cézanne. When Cézanne declared to Émile Bernard in 1904, quote, I would like to be a child, it provided some indication of the depth of this post-impressionist significance in establishing the groundwork for the modernist uptake of the child and the childlike. For Cézanne, a painter whose subjects varied dramatically, it was not necessarily what he painted that mattered, but how he painted it. Painstakingly mulling over single brushstrokes for several hours, Cézanne reduced naturally occurring forms to their geometric essentials, while simultaneously exploring new perspectival dimensions which rejected standard single-point perspective in favour of a sort of binocular vision by which slightly different though concurrent visual perceptions of the same image would present the depth and variation of what one truly sees. The phenomenological philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty understood Cézanne's renunciation of these traditional artistic elements as a bid to achieve, quote, a lived perspective, by effectuating all the complexities observed by the eye in a single moment. Moreover, this perspective was forever changing for Cézanne, for not only when painting was he capturing a moment in time that once past could never return, but it was subject to the vicissitudes of his own personal perception. As Turner explains, by, quote, conveying a structured idea in paint of the sensory explosion of first sight, Cézanne was hoping to recreate something akin to the Damascus moment, producing a visual snapshot which captures the momentousness of one's exposure to the complexity of true vision and perception. This visual epiphany can be understood alongside the extreme freshness of vision of which modernists believe the child to be in possession. To turn away, as modern artists increasingly did, from traditional compositions, structures, subjects, colours and perspectives in art, was to submit oneself to the visual and artistic clarity of the child untouched. When Ellen Handler Spitz considered, quote, how like an artist's studio is the bedroom of a small child, filled with highly invested possessions, she went some way to elucidating not only the innate and profound connection between childhood experiences and perceptions and the creative process, between the pursuit of truth and making sense inherent to both the curious child and the disillusioned creative practitioner, but also the complex untidiness intrinsic to both. And so as with all endeavours of great worth and revelation, the pursuit of truth found in the child within, through the journey into the past and one's past, is an art that requires patience, delicacy, and an awareness of the damaging dangers inherent. It is a careful lifting of each layer of one's childhood, of one's past, memory, experience, and personhood, but also that of others, so as to reveal that which lies buried further beneath without damaging or warping it. As Walter Benjamin once reflected, if, quote, there exists for each individual an image around which the entire world appears to founder, for how many does that image not rise out of an old toy chest? But like the gradual rummaging of a child in the darkest nooks and crannies of a chest containing their most precious treasures, it is a practice which must be done with full consciousness of the weight and power of one's own rummaging hands. Thank you very much for listening and watching. On the next slide, I've got my references if you would like to take a look.